All right, hello everyone. Thanks to those of you who have just come online. We are just getting started. I am Peter Doherty, Executive Director for the International Biometrics Society here at the International Biometric Office in Washington, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Journal Club. As you know, the Journal Club is open to all IBS members free of charge. And the primary purpose of the Journal Club, apart from presenting worthy papers in a more public setting, is to widen the scope of understanding of these papers and to hopefully provide a new networking opportunity for IBS members through a regular forum. And we should mention at this time that those of you who are joining us live will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to now hand the presentation over to Dr. Jim Todd, chair of the Journal Club and organizer. So Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and we hope that the Journal Club is informative and useful to you all. It is an opportunity to have some open-ended discussions and to ask questions about the paper. As Pete said, the opportunity to ask questions will come at the end. And also, we hope that it will build up understanding of new statistical points, and it's an opportunity to network and interact in the best traditions of the International Biometrics Society. Before I start, let me just go over a few housekeeping items to ensure we all follow this. Let's keep it simple. There are some important and complex technical points in the paper, but we don't want to be too technical in our discussion. Keep our comments short and to the point. Make sure that we speak slowly and clearly so that anyone whose first language is not English can understand. Let's try and be constructive to build a discussion and ask good questions, and to mute your microphones unless you're speaking. I think this is a way that the host can do that. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand. We will then unmute you to let you ask your question. The document and papers are available, and I think they're available on this screen. I'm just looking for them. This is, yeah. And we will record this, as Pete said, and put this on the website so that you can see that afterwards. So we're pleased that you are coming along to this, and feel free to engage with the discussion at the end, see how we can apply these methods. What I want to do now is have the pleasure of inviting Christopher Bilder to present his paper on informative group testing for multiplex assays. So over to you, Christopher.
Okay, thank you. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, I think everyone can see this. Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for attending this presentation, and thank you, Jim, for organizing it. This research that I'm presenting is joint research with Josh Tebbs at the University of South Carolina and Chris McMahan at Clemson University. So to begin here, let's start with a very general definition of what group testing is, and then go into an in-depth example where it is actually being used right now. So in a general context, group testing is the process of testing items together as one unit, often referred to as a group or pool, rather than individually, where the ultimate goal is to identify those items with some kind of binary trait of interest. So for a quick example, these items that are being pulled together could be blood specimens from different people, and portions of these blood specimens then are combined together into a single new specimen. And ultimately, you may want to identify which of these people are HIV positive. So that's our binary trait of interest. So here's a more extended example of the group testing process. So thousands of people each year are tested for chlamydia and gonorrhea by the State Hygienic Laboratory at the University of Iowa. Every day, they receive swab and urine specimens and test tubes from clinics across the state. And so what we have here is just simply 1 day's worth of a testing load that the state hygienic laboratory needs to test. And these specimens are mounted on racks. And so hopefully you can see my writing here. We see in this diagram here 2 different racks. And these racks are put into what's called a TCON DTS robotic platform that's used to form the groups. And the way that this works is that there is a robotic arm that has a multi-channel pipette on it. And this robotic arm goes over to the first set of specimens, goes down into the specimens, extracts 700 microliters from the test tubes, and then goes over to some empty test tubes and deposits the 700 microliters there. And that's where the group is going to be formed. The robotic arm then goes back to some other specimens, extracts 700 microliters, and then again deposits into where the groups are being formed. This process is repeated 4 times so that we have groups of size 4 that are formed. Once these grouped specimens are obtained, the Aptima Combo 2 assay is applied to them. And what this assay is a simultaneous test for chlamydia and gonorrhea. And since it's testing for more than one disease, it's referred to as a multiplex assay. These grouped specimens are mounted into the bays of Hologic's Panther system, this big box here. And inside this box, this is where the nucleic acid amplification testing is actually performed. In the end, it takes about 4 hours to perform the actual tests. And in total, starting with getting the specimens ready to go, forming the groups, and then reporting the results, it takes about 6 to 7 hours to do these tests. So here's a very crude diagram that helps demonstrate what's going on. We have these groups of size 4 that are being formed. We apply this multiplex assay to each group, and for each group we're going to get a positive or negative result for chlamydia and a positive or negative result for gonorrhea. Now, if a group tests negatively for both diseases, then that says all individuals within it can be declared disease-free. So notice it only took 1 test to determine that 4 people are disease-free, where if you would have done individual testing to begin with, or tested everyone separately, it would have took 4 tests to determine that 4 people were disease-free. Now, of course, a group could test positively for at least 1 disease. And when that happens, we need to determine, well, who's positive and who's negative and for which diseases. What the State Hygienic Laboratory simply does, it retests all group members separately with this exact same Aptima Combo 2 assay. So just because a group might test positively for just 1 disease, they still apply the same assay because it's a lot easier for the lab to implement. And so what we see here is we have a 2-stage hierarchical testing algorithm that's being used. You test in groups. If a group comes back positive, then you go to a 2nd stage for individual testing. Now, fortunately, in the state of Iowa, there's a low prevalence for these diseases. Most groups will test negatively. And so what that means is that through using group testing, you're going to have a smaller number of tests overall than if you would have tested everyone separately to begin with. This smaller number of tests then translates into a significant cost and time savings. So over a recent 5-year period, the State Hygienic Laboratory estimates that they've saved $3 million by using group testing. And it's not just Iowa that uses this process. Many other laboratories use this process across the United States for chlamydia and gonorrhea testing. Sometimes they use different group sizes. Sometimes they'll actually form the groups by hand rather than using a robot. And group testing is used in a wide variety of other settings as well. So with respect to infectious disease testing, probably the biggest place where it's used is to screen blood donations for infectious diseases. So for example, the American Red Cross uses groups of size 16 to test for a number of different diseases. Infectious disease testing is also performed for animals, and group testing is also often used there. So for example, bovine viral diarrhea virus is a big one where group testing is used. But group testing is also used outside of infectious disease testing, such as for pharmaceutical drug discovery. Now, this Aptima Combo 2 assay that I mentioned is a multiplex assay, and laboratories like multiplex assays because they save time and money over using single disease assays. And there's a number of multiplex assays that are out there, and the number is growing. Commonly in blood donation screening, you see multiplex assays used for HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C simultaneous detection. The company BD, a couple years ago, introduced BD Max, which combines chlamydia, gonorrhea, and trichomoniasis testing. And there's a number of other multiplex assays that are currently being developed or are developed but not necessarily approved for worldwide use yet. Many of them are including Mycoplasma genitalium as part of their testing. This has been recently characterized as the next STD superbug. Now, perhaps surprisingly, it's only been recent that statistical research has investigated these multiplex assays as applied through group testing algorithms. Myself and my colleagues back in 2013, we had the first paper on it where we focused on this two-stage hierarchical group testing algorithm that was used by the State Hygienic Laboratory. And a few years later, we followed up on that by looking at algorithms that could use more than two hierarchical stages, because this is frequently used with single disease assays, and they can be more efficient, meaning a smaller number of tests overall than just a two-stage algorithm. So for example, here's how HIV testing has been done, at least in the past, in San Francisco, where they start with an initial group size of 50. If that tests negatively, they're done, everyone's cleared. If it tests positively though, then they break those 50 up into 5 groups of size 10 for a second stage of testing. If one of those subgroups comes back positive, then they go to a third stage of testing for that subgroup or those members and do individual testing. Now, with these two papers, we're very fortunate. For both of them, we won the Outstanding Statistical Application Award. And for that second one, we received the Best Paper in Biometrics Award last year. Now, with that research, we were not necessarily completely satisfied. And the reason was because this previous research assumes every individual has an equal probability of being positive for a particular disease. So all people in Iowa have the same probability of chlamydia. All people in Iowa have the same probability of gonorrhea. But, you know, we're wondering, well, what if one could differentiate amongst individuals who are at higher risk, maybe due to their behavior, or maybe due to symptoms that present themselves when they go to a clinic to be tested. And maybe we could treat those individuals who are at high risk differently in a group testing algorithm than those that are low risk, and thus reduce the number of tests that are needed to determine who's positive and who's negative. So when one does use this extra kind of information in a group testing algorithm, one performs what is called informative group testing. And as you might expect, through using this extra information, the testing process can be more efficient. Again, smaller number of tests. But all the research prior to this, what I'm talking about here today, was focused on single disease assays. And so then what we wanted to do with our paper was to develop informative group testing algorithms for multiplex assays using a hierarchical testing process. So with group testing, I think one of the reasons why some people like it is because it has an interesting stochastic framework, meaning you're working with unobservable, correlated, binary random variables that represent the individual disease statuses of people. So the binary part comes in because either a person's positive or negative for a disease. The correlated part comes in because with a multiplex assay, you're testing for multiple diseases. And then lastly, the unobservable part comes in because unfortunately these assays are not 100% perfect. You can have false positives, you can have false negatives, and you need to take that into account. So let's define some notation then with this. Let's let y tilde sub I k be the true binary status, meaning 1 for positive, 0 for negative, for individual I and disease k. We're going to be very interested in, for individual I, the joint probabilities of disease for up to k different diseases that this multiplex assay tests for. So for the k equal 2 case, then we will have 4 different joint probabilities of disease. In particular, this p sub I 0, 0 represents the probability that individual I is negative for disease 1 and for disease 2. And if we turn things around and look at 1 minus p sub I 0, 0, we get something that's very useful. And that is the probability of being positive for at least 1 disease. And you might think that large values here would indicate high risk. And again, you might want to treat those individuals who are at high risk differently in a group testing algorithm than those that are at low risk in a way to try to reduce the number of overall tests. And so that's what we will do. We will try to take advantage of heterogeneity that exists amongst these kinds of probabilities. Eventually, these probabilities can be estimated simply using covariate information on the individuals and through using regression models. So let's consider that we have, let's say, one initial group of size capital I. We're going to let G sub Sjk be the group test result for the kth disease in group J at stage S. I'll have a diagram coming up shortly to help demonstrate that. We'll let C sub S be the number of groups in stage S. M sub Sj be the number of subgroups that group J at stage S is divided into if it tests positively for at least 1 disease. And we'll have capital S in different hierarchical stages. So here's the diagram that we saw earlier, but now put into the context of a multiplex assay. So again, we start off with 50 individuals in a group, and now we're going to have k different test responses with them. And if G sub 1, 1 plus is greater than 0, meaning that this initial group has tested positive for at least 1 disease, so that plus means I'm summing over the diseases there, then we go to a second stage of testing, and we have these 5 groups of size 10. And now if G sub 2, 1 plus is greater than 0, that means that particular subgroup, the first subgroup in stage 2, has tested positively for at least 1 disease, and those individuals are going to go to a stage 3 for individual testing. Now also I need to define what is called an ancestor group. And all that an ancestor group is groups of prior stages that led to the testing of group J in stage S. All this is going to, or the reason why I'm introducing this is because it helps with some of the notation coming up shortly. And so this superscript T here on the G represents what previous stage I'm talking about. So if we focus in on this particular subgroup, notice that it has one ancestor group that was in stage 1. And so I can write out G sub 2, 1, 1 with the superscript 1, all the way down to G sub 2, 1, capital K with a superscript 1, as another way to represent what happened in stage 1. So basically we have 2 kinds of notation here that are equivalent. And the only reason why I'm introducing this is because it's going to be easier to write some stuff out shortly. So whenever someone implements a group testing algorithm, one wants to have some kind of idea of, well, how many tests is it going to take to determine who's positive and who's negative? So let's let capital T be a random variable denoting the number of tests corresponding to an initial group of size I. Then one can derive the expected number of tests. I'm just going to focus on 3 or more stages. One can derive the expected number of tests to be this expression here. So the 1 in the expression represents that first test that you're always going to do in stage 1. And then I'm going to sum over all the stages but the last one, because there's no more testing after the last one. I'm going to sum over all the subgroups that are within each stage. And what I'm going to sum is this M sub S J, which is the number of tests that will be performed if group J in stage S tests positively for at least one disease. And what's the probability that that group tests positively? Well, that's what this large joint probability represents. This joint probability is written in terms of this ancestor notation. So in order for group J in stage S to test positively, you needed its ancestor in stage 1 to test positively for at least one disease. You need its ancestor in stage 2 to test positively for at least one disease, and so on. Now, this joint probability can take some time to derive. And in my supporting information for this paper, it took about 6.5 pages. And unfortunately, there's not a nice little form that I can put on just one slide that represents this joint probability. So instead, what I'll do, I'll just say that this joint probability is a function of the testing configuration, meaning how many stages you're using, what are the group sizes, who's in what group, and so on. It's a function of the assay sensitivity and specificity, meaning how accurate the assay is every time you apply it. And it's also a function of these joint probabilities of disease for every individual that's in this initial group. Now also, when you perform group testing, you want to choose then the testing configuration that will lead to the least number of tests, because every test costs money. And so what you need to do is try to figure it out. What is that best testing configuration in terms of, what should the initial group size be? Should it be 50, or should I start off with just 2? What should the subgroup sizes be? Should they be 5 groups of size 10 in stage 2, 10 groups of size 5 in stage 2, or maybe something else? How many stages should you use? And which individuals should you put in what subgroups? So to make this decision then, what one could do is choose a testing configuration that minimizes some objective function. And what's used most often in group testing is the expected number of tests per individual as that objective function. In other words, minimize the expected value of t divided by I. We divide by I to make it a fair comparison when we compare starting off with an initial group size of 50 versus an initial group size of 2. So to find this testing configuration that minimizes this objective function, what we could do is simply examine all possible testing configurations, calculate the objective function, and choose the one that is results in the smallest value for that objective function. Unfortunately, there's a lot of testing configurations that are possible, depending upon the number of stages and what your maximum value for let's say I would be. And so to limit the number of testing configurations to search over, what we're going to do is as follows. We're going to take our individuals or their corresponding specimens, essentially, and order them by their probabilities of being positive for at least one disease. Then we take these ordered individuals and sequentially assign them to subgroups of equal or smaller size. So what that means is that those individuals who have a low probability of being positive for at least one disease will end up being in larger groups than those with high probabilities of being positive for at least one disease. And in the end, the testing configuration that does this minimization is what I refer to as the optimal testing configuration, or OTC for short. So I've been mainly focusing on 3 or more stages, but what if you just did 2 stages? Well, in the end, it's actually just equivalent to 3-stage testing, but you don't test that initial group in stage 1. This equivalence because of the hierarchical nature of the testing. And so stages 2 and 3 of 3-stage testing correspond to 2-stage testing. And the reason why you want to think of this equivalence is because you want to have some way of ordering these individuals so you can somehow take advantage of the fact that some individuals are at low risk, some are at high risk. And the only way to do this in a 2-stage testing algorithm is to consider it as a special case of 3-stage testing. So once you do that, essentially the expected value of T expression is very similar to what I just presented before, and everything just kind of follows along. So let's take a look at an application involving the Aptima Combo 2 assay. Now, ideally, what I would like to do to try this all out is actually implement different testing configurations upon the exact same specimens, and then choose the testing configuration that ends up being the most efficient, lowest number of tests. Unfortunately, this is very impractical to do due to the expense in testing, the time it takes, and also simply the volume of available specimen material. So because of that, what we decided to do in our paper was to try to emulate via a computer how testing could be performed using some retrospective data that we had obtained from laboratories. So we have 2 years worth of data from 3 US states. And for each state, we have the following information. We have information about the chlamydia and gonorrhea final outcomes, positive or negative status. We have information about patient behavior. We have information about clinical observations that were made by a medical provider when these individuals were tested. And so then using this information, we can then estimate these joint probabilities of disease using regression models. So here's a real rough outline of our application process. What we're going to do is use our earlier year of this 2 years worth of data as a training data set, and then estimate these joint probabilities of disease using a simple multinomial regression model. Then using these estimates, essentially put them into our expected value of T expression for where we have the true values before, so we can approximate what one OTC would be. And we do this in a slightly different manner than what I had described earlier. We use what's referred to as a non-adaptive approach proposed by Black et al. 2015. I don't have time to get into all the details behind it, but in the end, what we get is one testing configuration that can be applied across the thousands of people that would be tested for these diseases. So for example, the approximate OTC for Idaho females ends up being this for 3 stages. We start off with an initial group size of 8 that test positively. We go to a second stage of testing where we break them up into subgroups of 4, 3, and 1, and then go to a third stage of testing when needed to do individual testing. Next, what we're going to do is use the later year as a test data set. So we're going to estimate these joint probabilities of disease for those individuals in the test data using this training data model that we obtained earlier, and then apply this approximate OTC to those individuals that were in the training data set. So for example, for Idaho females, the first 8 people in that data set will have this algorithm applied to them. The next 8 people, this same algorithm, and so on. Now, unfortunately, since these tests are not 100% accurate, the sensitivity and specificity, they're at least usually about 0.95. We need to somehow still to take into account the possibility of testing error. And so the best way that we've been able to figure out to do this is to use some Monte Carlo simulation in this emulation process by treating the final chlamydia and gonorrhea outcomes in the data set as the true statuses, and then using the manufacturer reported sensitivity and specificity levels do some Monte Carlo simulation to simulate what a group response would be, or an individual testing response would be. And we do this across 500 simulations. So here's a table summarizing the results. We have everything broken up by state, by gender, and we break it up by gender because the manufacturer reports sensitivity and specificity of the assay by gender. Number of individuals tested. We'll look at 2 or 3 stages, and then we get over to the results. So this non-informative column corresponds to if you were to ignore this extra information that we have on every individual and essentially treat everyone as having an equal probability of being positive for a particular disease. And on average for Idaho females, it would take about 2,200 tests to determine who's positive and who's negative. If we were to apply these informative group testing algorithms, it goes down to 2,100. So we have a modest reduction of about 5% of tests. But this reduction can be more significant. So for Idaho males, we can see that that reduction could be 15%. And across this table, what we see is that in general, informative group testing reduces the number of tests, and it works better for males than it does for females. Well, why? Well, it comes down to the variability and the probabilities of being positive for at least one disease. It's actually much larger for the males than it is for the females. So for example, with respect to Iowa females, where this methodology didn't work the best, what we have here is a histogram of all the estimated joint probabilities of being negative for both diseases. And we see how these probabilities are tightly clustered around 0.9, 0.95, and 1. But for Idaho males, where this method worked the best, we see a lot more variability in these probabilities of being positive for at least one disease. That's why this method worked well. So in conclusion here, I unfortunately don't have time to get into a discussion about accuracy. That's very important whenever you're doing infectious disease testing. You know, in the end, essentially the accuracy you could say is comparable to non-informative group testing. If you want to know more about what myself and my colleagues do in terms of group testing, you can take a look at our research website, chrisbilder.com/group testing. In particular, at this website, we point to our package that we've constructed that implements many of our research methods. The stuff that's corresponding to this paper will be available shortly. We've also recently constructed a Shiny app for non-informative group testing, which really makes it easy to try to pick out, well, what would be the best group sizes, for example. And lastly, if you'd like to have a general introduction to the group testing problem beyond what I did here today, I recently had a couple papers published or will be published shortly in Wiley StatsRef that give a nice introduction. So thank you for attending this presentation, and that concludes my talk.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a very good presentation there. So what we're going to do now is go on to the discussants slides. We don't have a separate discussant, so I've got a few slides that I've made up for this. And I realize that some of my questions that I've got on these slides have actually been answered by you. And what I'll do is just go through this, and then we'll ask some more questions from there onwards. Okay, so my discussion slides are about informative group testing for multiplex, using a multiplex assays, which is what you've been presenting now. And yeah, and in the background that I got from your paper, I see that infectious disease testing has become more efficient because you're using both pooled samples from multiple individuals, but also the use of multiplex assays can test for several conditions at the same time. And the question your paper was really answering is, how can we put all of this together to maximize the benefits of the pooled samples from multiple individuals and the multiplex assays. And this would be a major step forward if it produced more efficient algorithms for testing. And so you're suggesting that we can use the signs and symptoms and the risk factor characteristics from the individuals who contributed these samples to create a probability of the diseases that these individuals might have. And then the optimal testing configuration will be based upon these probabilities using the random variable, which is the expectation of the number of tests that will be needed based on these probabilities. And you calculate the joint probabilities for all of these diseases in the multiplex assay. Yeah. Okay, and as you point out, we can use regression modeling to obtain these probabilities from the known risk factors, from the signs and symptoms that have been recorded. This may be as simple as the age and sex of individuals, but it may also include their sexual behavior and other characteristics. However, one question that I had here is, in practice, there may be quite a bit of missing data from these risk factors. Maybe age and sex might be well documented, but some of the other factors may be missing. How would you deal with that in your regression modeling? And you've answered this about the advantage over the homogeneous or equal probabilities that you suggest, and you've shown that by grouping together individuals with the different probabilities, you will actually increase that, you decrease or optimize the number of tests that will be needed. The question I also had is about the need for training data. Now, in your case, you've used training data from the preceding year in order to get the regression parameters that will be used for the other ones. I mean, is it possible for the training data to be updated on a sequential basis over time, or is that something which you've tried or found is difficult to do? The sensitivity and specificity was to assess the accuracy of the estimates. Now, a question I had about this, well, in fact, it's not about sensitivity and specificity. It's more about how do you determine the initial batch sizes to be used in this. And that must be part of the application. And related to that is the batch sizes related to the prevalence of the disease in the population, or the prevalence of the disease that you would expect from your characteristics of individuals in that population. In a sense, you are using the pooled positive predictive values and negative predictive values as sort of conditional probabilities for the correct diagnosis. And so you can use your marginal probabilities in each of your pooled sample set to obtain the batch sizes. Now, the question I had about that is the application trying to equalize the cumulative positive predictive value in each of your groups that you're testing? Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. You then applied your theoretical considerations to a practical consideration using the statewide data over 2 years in 3 US states with the Aptima Combo 2 assay. How stable was these regression characteristics that you used? Did they change over time? I realized from your paper that you only did the regression characteristics for 1 year and then used them in the second year. But you could also obtain the regression characteristics for the second year and see whether they differed from 1 year to another, or even from one state to another. Did you do that? Was there much difference, and was there a need for redoing the regression characteristics from 1 year to another? I think you answered the question about the greater reductions in the males compared to the females relating to the greater variability in the outcome probability. And so I think that question is pretty much answered. I was very interested in your R application for use with real testing for the real-time testing for infectious diseases. Have you had any applications? Have you heard of any applications of that? And what other areas would that be useful in? Okay, next slide, please. It says extensions and questions. Now, one of the extensions mentioned in the paper is that you could identify incongruous test results. In other words, test results where the probability of being positive was very low, and you get a positive result from that particular group. And you could then say, well, confirmatory tests. Have you got a rule as to when confirmatory tests should be applied? Perhaps if the cumulative probability was quite low, less than 0.1, and yet the test turned out to be positive, would you apply confirmatory tests in some way to samples where you expected them to be negative? What are the criteria then for having non-equal group sizes? You mentioned the advantages of that, but are there criteria that you've worked out as to when that might be advantageous? Also, a question I had about the unequal prevalence of disease or conditions. If the prevalence of gonorrhea was very different from the prevalence of chlamydia, would that affect the way that you you organized your tests? Okay, and is there ever any advantages of using uniplex or single assays for one of your rounds if the prevalence of disease was very different? So that concludes my discussant slides. Perhaps we can go back and let you respond to some of those and see whether there's any further questions in a minute.
Sure. Yeah, some really good questions. Let's see, how about we just start with the slide that you're on right now. So one of the questions was, are there advantages of the uniplex assay in the second round? And you know, initially when we started doing this research here, we were wondering, well, you would think that there would be, because you're testing for something that you've already perhaps declared everyone being negative for. And it will be interesting at least to work it out in a mathematical sense to see if there could be any kind of benefit from it. The problem is that, you know, this testing lab has this, you know, you saw the picture of that large Panther system. They have this equipment dedicated towards, you know, doing chlamydia and gonorrhea testing with this particular assay, you know, essentially almost daily. And it would be, and what they've been telling us at this particular location, it would be difficult for them to switch things out to actually use something else other than the multiplex assay. And you know, one of the things I've been interested in looking at further too is, well, if you're retesting these people for a disease that maybe you've already thought they were negative to begin with because the group was negative, is there some additional information that you're getting from that? Because you might, for example, pick up some information about the accuracy of the testing algorithm itself, because it's not inconceivable that, let's say, if the group was positive for chlamydia, negative for gonorrhea, so you're testing the whole group again for both, inconceivable that you would get maybe some positive gonorrheas that pop up. And so I've always been interested in exploring that further, and to some respect too, it's hard to get that kind of level of data as well, because they don't, what they record is the final result, not the result at each stage of the process. So anyway, let's see.
Christopher, I can move between any of the slides if necessary. So.
Okay. Well, we can stay here for a little bit longer. So for non-equal group sizes, you know, that's where the, you know, this algorithm is, you know, trying to find what's optimal, and you know, and it finds that, you know, if you do have, you know, essentially the more variability there is in these probabilities being positive, essentially the more different these group sizes will end up being. because the algorithm is going to try to take advantage of those who are high risk versus those who are low risk. When we move on to slide 4, I was taking a lot of notes throughout here, and now I can't read my notes that I was taking.
Yeah, so question about the stability of the regression characteristics. Do they remain the same from one place to another and one year to another, or do they change a lot and require reparameterization? Hello?
Christopher, are you still with us?
Than females would have in terms of the information.
I think your audio had your audio had been muted for just a moment. So if you can start with your point at the beginning of your point once again.
Sure. I'm sorry. So we understand that conditions could be different, and also
Hi, Christopher. I believe this is Star. I believe that your audio is cutting in and out right now.
Oh dear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Let's try this again. So with the data, we estimated these models by state and by gender, recognizing that males and females, actually they have different information collected on them, and also missions in Idaho could be different than from Iowa. And in terms of how stable they are over time, I am unsure. I think that's something that's interesting. Typically, these people that are being tested essentially come from the same sets of people. So it could be just people coming into a clinic who are being tested in a city. It could be that the clinic's essentially maybe going to a high school and providing tests there. And I don't think that necessarily changes over time in terms of the type of people that they're trying to get tested. So yeah, there could be differences, but I am unsure if there are, and I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't. It's not the best answer. But
I suppose if it was an epidemic and there was sort of like an epidemic which came in, like a flu epidemic, then it might be very different characteristics at one point in the year compared to another point in the year.
True, yeah. And I mean, and you will see, and in some respect, you will see this happen for certain cities where it's just the prevalence is a lot higher for that city than it is maybe someplace else. So in terms of the R stuff, to be honest, I don't know yet if anyone has used it. I mean, I can tell you in general for our package that we have a number of lots of downloads over every year, but they could be using some other aspects of the package itself. Is there anything on that other on that slide that you would like me to specifically address?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we go to slide 3 then?
All right. There you are.
So missing data. Fortunately, in this particular case, in order for people to get tested, they have an actual form that the medical providers essentially filling out for them, and all the boxes essentially have to be checked. Otherwise, you're not going to get tested. So that is helpful, at least in this particular case. But where a missing data issue could occur, because these are somewhat sensitive questions that are being asked of people. Now, I wasn't for sure exactly what you meant by the batch sizes. Could you help explain it?
Well, I just wondered whether, in fact, it wasn't to do with sensitivity and specificity. I think it's more to do with the prevalence of disease. If the disease is very low prevalence, then you might have larger batch sizes. And if it was a higher prevalence of the disease, you might then have smaller batch sizes. Is that the kind of thing that happens?
Are you referring to, when you say batch sizes, are you talking about the group size itself? Or let's say if I have 100 people to test, I need to figure out,
the initial batch size, the initial size of how many people you're going to put together.
Okay, yeah, and that's what the algorithm does. Let's start off with maybe initial group size of 2. Let's find the best. Initial group size of 3, find the best. Across all batch sizes up to some limit, because these assays are typically calibrated or tested up to a certain limit. And so, we essentially search throughout those group sizes for that best one.
Yeah.
And so then you were asking about the PPV and NPV stuff. Yeah, I had never thought about trying to equalize the cumulative PPV in each group. The only place that the paper we briefly talked about, and I don't know if this is what you were trying to refer to, is we briefly referred to essentially trying to do some confirmatory tests on those people who were, let's say, diagnosed a certain way, but yet their PPV and NPV values don't necessarily make sense according to that diagnosis. That's actually coming up to a subject of a new paper that we're writing to more formally look at that. We are still in more introductory stage, but it's an advantage of the informative group testing process that one obtains for every individual, potentially a different PPV and NPV, and one could go back and use that to determine if the algorithm got it right. In other words, perform these confirmatory tests. And that's something I think we're excited about, but I don't think we're necessarily there yet of finding the best way to go about using that information.
Okay. Okay, so it's probably a good idea now. I mean, we've only got 5 minutes left to see whether there's any questions from the audience, whether they want to ask you anything about this. Anyone have any questions? Pete, can you see whether anyone puts their hands up?
Yes, I'm checking. I don't see anyone with their hands up. If anyone has a question, you can use the raise hand feature, and now would be a good time. You can also share your questions later, but now would be wonderful if you have something ready.
Yeah.
But it does not appear that there are questions at this time.
Okay. Okay. So perhaps what we ought to do is just, we can thank Christopher here. Christopher, just a final point then. Do you think there's, what are the potentials for this, not just for chlamydia and gonorrhea? I mean, it's potentially useful for any infectious disease testing, is that right?
Yeah, and you got to have that some kind of external information. So, for example, like for blood donation screening, at least in the U.S. for the American Red Cross, you have to fill out a questionnaire, and you could use that information from the questionnaire to also help out then with how they do the pooling process or grouping process for the American Red Cross. But there are other applications where you might not have this extra information. So obviously, in that case, these methods aren't applicable. But there are definitely a number of situations where this could greatly reduce the number of tests.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your paper and going through that paper. I certainly enjoyed looking at the getting this information out of your paper, and thank you for your presentation, which was very clear and interesting. So
Thank you.
unless there's any other points that anyone else wants to make, I think we shall close for now, and we shall keep it to that. We shall say that there will be another journal club in 2 months' time. Have I got the date?
Let's see, I can look up the dates for you quickly. I believe, let me see, Star, perhaps you can check that, but it is in 2 months' time, I believe this same week, 2 months from now, in August.
Good, in August, that's right. On a Thursday afternoon, for me anyway, Thursday afternoon, Thursday morning in the US. And I would like to say that I think that use of Zoom is actually a lot easier than the ReadyTalk, but I suppose you might want to evaluate that formally.
Oh, certainly, will do. Yes.
Yeah.
No, and thanks to both of you, Christopher and Jim.
And the next journal club is going to be on August 8th, 2019.
Oh, okay.
Okay, a comment from Madeline just to say excellent presentation, very relevant work. Thank you very much. So thank you, Chris, from the participants as well.
Thank you.
And we appreciate that comment as well. Also, for anyone participating today, just so you are aware, a recording of the session will be available on the IBS website under the Journal Club tab, so please feel free to listen again. And thanks again to everyone for joining us, and have a great week. You may now disconnect from this session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.